Hi, I'm Natasha Frost, and this is Todd Clear. We're at the ASC meetings in 2013 in Atlanta, and I'm so honored to have the opportunity to interview Todd Clear for the Oral History Project for the ASC. Todd is a preeminent scholar in the area of corrections, community justice, and most recently justice reinvestment. He is the author of 13 books now, over 100 articles, and many other sort of newsletter articles, things like that. He's very, very active in the ASC and the ACJS. He's been involved in both organizations for more than 30 years. He may be the only person to have simultaneously served as president of the ACJS and vice president of the ASC at the same time. He has won numerous awards from both of those organizations, including the Bruce Smith Award from the ACJS, the Block Award from the ASC. He was most recently president of the ASC in 2009. He hails from, well, let me start by saying he got his PhD at the University of Albany in the 1970s, not to date you. He earned a master's en route from the University of Albany as well, and his bachelor's degree is from a small Anderson College, which is a small religious school in Anderson, Indiana. So many people may not know Todd as a country boy, but he hails from the Midwest, and if rumor has it correctly, he may be the only male in his family who is not a member of the ministry. He is secretly a deeply religious man, although most people would not know it. So with that brief introduction, let me introduce Todd Clear and open by asking him how he became a criminologist, and I know this is a particularly interesting history.
Well, so it's funny. I got interested in this field by accident. I was a senior at Anderson College and a social work major, and I had this idea that I was going to be some kind of social worker with dependent children or something like that. But to get a degree at Anderson College, you had to do an internship. And the morning the internships were handed out, I slept in, and when I got to the office, there was only one left at the Indiana State Reformatory. So there was either do that or stay an extra semester. So I took that, and it changed my life. The first day I went in, well, I had hair, sort of down to the back of my waist, and I was a musician at the time, and I thought I was going to go into the prison, and I had this image that there would be, men with pickaxes in the middle of the yard or something, and I was going to walk in, and I was going to stand at the top of the steps, and I was going to stick my fist in the air, I was going to say, "Power to the people," and they were all going to turn around and say, "Power to the people," and I was sort of going to go in, to applause or something. But what actually happened was I was harassed, I was pinched twice, a lot of cat whistles, long hair in the 1970s was not everybody's idea in those days of the way to be, especially for poor working class people who were in prison. And I left shaking and completely captivated by what was going on there. I couldn't imagine this world. And from that time on, I devoted my life to the field of corrections, working with people who've been convicted of crimes.
Okay. And what were your influences, both personal and sort of professional, from the literature, things you had read as a student, for example?
I think the most important event that happened to me was in my first month of graduate study in Albany, 1971, September. And the Attica, if you call it a revolt, it tells you politics. If you call it a riot, so it's sort of a political statement. Anyway, the Attica revolt happened, and I was taking a class on incarceration, and I had this idea that I was going to learn how to run a really great prison, and I was going to go back into the field, and I was going to run a humane prison where people really got rehabilitated. And the Attica revolt was in many ways the most fundamental challenge to that idea you could have. It was violent, it was anti-state. They didn't ask for more treatment programs. They asked for food and rights and stuff like that. And I got involved in some research work on this. And again, I had the long hair and the whole deal. And I was in the New York State Department of Corrections. In those days, they used to get a bomb threat every day or so, and they would have these bomb threats. And one day we were outside waiting for the building to be cleared because a bomb threat had been called in, and one of the old corrections guys said to me, so what are you going to do when you finish grad? Because they hated us, we were studying their foibles, right? But he said, so what are you going to do when you finish graduate school? And I said, I'm going to be a prison warden. I had a beard and long hair, and he looked at me and said, just wait right here. And he went away and he came back with a few guys, and he said, so what are you going to do when you leave graduate school? I said, I'm going to be a prison warden. They all started laughing. And I was like, oh, maybe this is not my thing. And Attica opened my eyes to what prisons really are. Those people in prison who just professor then. He was a trainer. He didn't have a PhD. He had a master's degree in psychology, and he had a career dedicated toward helping the correction system, managers, administrators be better at their work. And I followed him around, and I mimicked everything he did. It was funny. At parties in graduate school, I would be going to a party, people would say, "You're doing a Vince O'Leary invitation." Tell me. But when I graduated, I went into his office, the president's office at Albany, big old office, and I said, "How can I thank you?" And I thought he was going to say, go and do this or whatever. He said, "You can't thank me. You can't possibly thank me." And I was like, "What?" And he said, "I've done more for you than you can possibly ever do for me. The only thing that you can do is do the same thing I've done for you for someone else."
All right.
And it was like, oh, I get it.
Right.
So, and I feel, I think I told you that same speech, right?
Right.
So, I think that what you have as a professor is some precious thing that's been given to you for free, really, by somebody else, and the only thing you can do is give it away. It's really a powerful
Pay it
idea.
forward,
Right.
which is what you have with me and many other mentees as well.
Yeah, those poor suckers.
I know, right? So I find it interesting that Todd immediately went to your experiences in the field, because I think you've always had this real connection to the actual working world of corrections, and whether it be probation, prisons. You're the antithesis of an ivory tower scholar, in every way. So I wondered sort of if you have any biographical connections back to the world of academia. I know you do. So I wondered if you want to talk. You talked a lot about that, but your background, your family background.
So my father had a PhD in sociology. His he did his dissertation at Chicago. His dissertation committee, even though he studied churches and social movements really, and the social movement he studied was church, his dissertation committee had Thrasher, McKay, and Sutherland on it.
Right.
And he was trained by some of the greatest. Now they weren't really criminologists in those days. We started seeing them as criminologists retrospectively. They were sociologists.
Right.
And sociology at Chicago was sociology, and because in Chicago if you were interested in sociologists later became interested in power. But what sociologists in those days were interested in really was the distribution of social benefits and social opportunities and social arrangements. And the best way to understand that was through understanding crime. And so these guys who were sociologists wanted to understand how society worked, and they did it by understanding how people who sort of go like this against to society, where they are, but not psychologically, but in terms of institutionally, socially. And so he was trained by sociologists who were, in fact, we now know, the founding criminologists for our field, and he always had a criminology perspective. And as a college professor, many years later, he started the first criminal justice program, undergraduate criminal justice program in Indiana. If I had been 5 years later in my study, I probably would have been a criminal justice major in college.
Right. And so would you say, and the rest of your family went into the ministry and not into academia, so you were the only child in your family to go the academic route, even though you had a father who studied?
That's right. Well, my father was an ordained minister also. Both my brothers, all my uncles, almost all of my cousins. I tell people that I've been on more prayer lists than almost anybody.
Right,
probably,
right.
Anyway. But and people have not been specific enough in what they've asked for in those prayers, I'm sure. So, and I think because religion was such an important part of my life growing up, and my family's conversation, that deeply held beliefs about the way things ought to be, and about right and wrong, and about justice, are really the most powerful themes of the work that I do, I think, and also of the things that I find interesting in our field.
And take a minute to sort of explain your intellectual trajectory. And you've been through a number, I named corrections, I named community justice, now justice reinvestment, but really started out in probation,
Right,
in the early days. So.
And you said this thing about connection to the field. So I never was a probation officer. My father actually retired as a professor and became a probation officer, ironically. And we wrote a couple of things when he was a probation officer, which is but I was very proud that if I did training programs for probation officers, they did not know that I'd never been a probation officer, because I was so. I did my doctoral dissertation in a probation agency in New York, and it was over a 3-year period gathering data, and then in Rochester, New York, and then in 5 of the cities around Boston, Middlesex County. And I'm nervous to say it. It's not Woburn, it's Woburn. I learned stuff like that. And I spent so much time in probation agencies, and I was such a sponge, And I was interested in risk. I still am very interested in risk. I think people don't really understand risk, even though it's become parlance. And I really, even though I built this idea that the only justification must be done, then I think you can use prison. And so while the prison system was growing, I was thinking it should be really shrinking. And wrote a book with Vince O'Leary, and we ended up having an argument over this. I don't know, a debate, I guess. He wanted to call it managing the offender in the community, and I wanted to call it controlling the offender in the community, because I believed in this idea of risk control. I still do. And that book was the first in a series of books that sort of marched my thinking. So I thought you can control people in the community, and if you did that, everybody, all these judges and all the politicians would look at that and say, wow, look, probation is just as good as prison, and it's so much cheaper, let's do it. And so we rebuilt probation as an instrument of controlling people. And I think there's a lot of things from what we did that was really very important. I don't want to cast it all away, but the system kept growing. I mean, it would tell you all these stories. The chief probation in San Francisco, Joan Peter-Silly did a study of intensive probation in California, and the San Francisco outcomes, I forget what the numbers were, something like 75% of the probationers in San Francisco end up back in prison.
Right.
In her study. And he said, this is a success, not a failure. And then I said in a public meeting, so if that's successful, I guess if 100% go back, that's winning the lottery, right? There had to be something wrong in the thinking that was going on in those days, that we were thinking that the purpose of probation is to make sure that guys end up in prison. And that is somehow a crowning glory for probation. Well, that has changed. Probation administrators don't talk that long, but in the 80s, there was this enormous commitment to the idea that probation could be just as nasty as sending a person into a box. And we used probation to basically create, some control boxes for people.
And then you moved into.
Then I wrote Harm in American Penal. I went on sabbatical, so I was burned out. I've been traveling all around the country, working with probation and parole agencies, doing training. I remember we were living in Metuchen, New Jersey at the time, and there was not a single year, I was at Rutgers, and there was not a single year that I was home for everybody's birthday. And I never bought a 5-day train pass, because I never went into the office for 5 days in a week. I was traveling, I'm sure at least 3 weeks out of 4, I was gone on at least one trip, sometimes 2. Really, with a group of people, really, not just me, trying to change corrections, trying to use risk as an idea, but trying to make it as an alternative to imprisonment, try to make it as a place that people could invest confidence and really grow it up. And I was exhausted. 1990, 91, I went on sabbatical in England and wrote this book, Harm in American Penology. And I go back and I read the introduction to that, and I go like, I got it right there. There's something wrong with this country, that we believe so deeply in the goodness of pain, and it is a cultural flaw in the American psyche. And we have packaged it actually as an idea and exported it to the world. And anyway, so that, and I came back from sabbatical and I said, I can't do this work anymore. I wrote a, this is very funny. Most of my life has just been a series of accidents, you know. And so I wrote this, I was trying to write the next book, and I was messing around with the ideas of, social justice, and I wrote a chapter, and it was sent in to David. It was given to David Karp to review. David Karp was a student of Etzioni's, and I didn't know Karp, and the review I got back was so smart. You know, it was like, I really like this. But
and then you move from there more squarely into the arena of mass incarceration,
yeah,
and
right.
how we solved that problem most recently.
Yeah. So and then I went through a personal crisis with a divorce, and went to Florida State, and in different orders. But anyway, met Dina Rose, and she and I started. I had written a paper. I read this paper. Used to be for years, you Google Todd Clear, you'd get this paper, the boomerang
Backfire.
effect, backfire, how prisons cause crime. And the story of that paper is really interesting. In fact, it's a 2-page footnote. It's a half-page footnote in the new book by a guy who wrote The Tipping Point. He's got a new book called David and Goliath. I forget his name. I think of his name. And so I wrote this paper. I couldn't get it published. But I gave it to some people around, to read it. And some guy who edited the Oklahoma Department of Corrections Research Journal, which must have a distribution of 7. Like, he got this paper, he said, can I publish this in the journal? I said, fine, publish it. And it started making the rounds, because corrections people knew that was true. They knew that prisons, there was a whole conversation going on in criminology, prison, incapacitate people, you prevent all this crime, the nation gets better. I mean, the data didn't bear any of it out, but the point is, criminologists were part and parcel of this great movement going on in the country, that if we just imprison enough of the right people, we can make ourselves safe. And people who ran prisons knew how absurd that was, because they knew what was going on. They knew people were coming in, getting fucked up, and then leaving. And they were coming back. And it was like, they knew this. So this paper went around. For years, if you Googled me, this was what came up, this paper that was published. She started working on the paper. And at one point, and I was very proud of this paper, and at one point she was saying, I think my name should go first. I said, no, this is really my paper. She said, well, let's count paragraphs. I said, I feel very strongly that the person who does the most contribution, which, by the way, is going to be painful for you to hear, because we have this book together and my name's first, and you know that I don't have the most. Anyway, so we actually counted the paragraphs, and she had written more than me.
So she got to go
So she got to go first. It was crushing. And that paper was submitted to criminology, got reviewed and rejected under one editor. And then Bob Bursick became editor, and we did this complete overhaul on it. Sent it back to Bursick and said, this has been rejected once by criminology, but it's so different. And because it had so much of the work he was interested in it, I said, maybe you would think. And it got the same reviews. The first time I got this review that said, this is stupid. The second review said, this is obvious. And a third of the review said, I've never thought of this before. It got the same 3 reviews, but Bursick said, I want to publish it. And that was the beginning. So then in Tallahassee, we did this work on communities, which became the next paper, which was really about, the next book, in Prison and Communities, which was really about how mass incarceration has had such enormously negative collateral consequences for communities, families, and that was, like, I think, the trilogy. Let's control people in the community. Oh my God, what have we done? And then look what we've done.
Right. And so which of those, your many contributions, are you most proud of? Maybe one of those, or something that you haven't even mentioned yet.
I'm going to surprise you. So when I was dean at Rutgers, I'm just stepped down as dean at Rutgers. In my years at dean at Rutgers, we got a chance to consolidate. There were a handful of institutions in New Jersey who were teaching college courses in prisons. Got some money from the Ford Foundation and the Sunshine Lady Foundation, and we offer college courses for every person who's eligible for college, who wants to take a class in the state of New Jersey, who is incarcerated, can take college courses for credit. And if they leave the system, the 8 institutions that are in this consortium, they will all honor every course those students take. Two of our graduates have been Truman Scholars. One of them is studying at the University of Cambridge in criminology right now. Guy who did 4 years in prison in the prison system in New Jersey. I'm more proud of that than anything else I've done.
Than any of your
Than anything else I've done.
contributions.
Yeah, that project is changing lives far beyond any sort of thing you can write on paper, and it's a bunch of dedicated people doing a ton of work, and I think I'm more proud of that than anything else I've done.
Oh, interesting. And also, sort of along those lines, well, along the lines of the work you're most proud of, how has your work endured criticism over the years? And it's faced quite a lot of criticism from...
I was the wacko left. I was on the front page of the website for NRA for years, a criminologist, pro-crime criminologist. And there was my picture. I was very proud of that too. And and there were people who just thought. I'll tell one story about this. I always tell stories. But people who just thought it is so obvious that if you send bad guys to prison, you remove their crimes. What are these guys thinking? And what I think has happened has been, and I hope our book is right. That the wind is out of those sails, and you don't have criminologists making meaningful arguments anymore. That the growth of the prison system is really a very significant part of the fight against crime. In the 1980s, I can't remember now what year it was. I was in a conference in Phoenix, and Joan Petersealy and I were speaking as luncheon speakers, and the third guy was the drug czar. I forget his name. And Joan got up and did what Joan does, talking about drug policy and drug policy probation and how probation can be relevant. I had this whole thing. I was going to stand up and do this whole thing on risk, but I was going to go third. And the drug czar got up and he started talking about new drug policies. We're going to test kids in high school, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And I threw my speech away. And there were 150 or 200 people there around tables, after dinner, and the punchline of the story is that the feds instructed the National Institute of Corrections director at the time to make me apologize.
And you didn't.
I was called to Washington. I said, look, you're going to ask me to give a speech. I'm going to say what I think. Don't ask me to give a speech if you don't want to hear what I think. And which is the great, really the great benefit of being a professor is that you are obligated to say what you think, right, even if you're wrong, and you often are. But there was a time in which that kind of talk was just heresy. It is now mainstream,
right? And
that is, I think, just the sea change that we are in the beginning days of.
And even in academia, in the field of ASC here, you have sometimes stirred some emotions among colleagues.
Yeah.
And I think specifically about your 2009 presidential address, where you came out in some ways against the move toward evidence-based research. And I wonder if you want to comment on your thoughts around the direction of the field.
So I'm glad to actually say something about it, because I love the evidence guys and some very good friends and very close colleagues in that business and people whose work I respect enormously.